Hello, this is the section on airworthiness requirements, part 2. Okay, the FAA in part 91 in the 400s talks about what things the owner and what things the operator are going to be held responsible for. The owner is the person that owns the airplane. However, if you're leasing the airplane, like here at Embry-Riddle, we lease a lot of our airplanes, we're also considered the owner for the purposes of this part of FAR 91. The operator can be interpreted as the person who's responsible for the airplane, like Embry-Riddle is the operator of the aircraft, but the FAA can and does also interpret that as the pilot in command of the aircraft is the operator, so you got to be careful for all of these. According to FAR 43, whenever maintenance gets done on an aircraft, the aircraft is unairworthy until what got done is recorded into the maintenance logbooks, the maintenance records. And not only is the mechanic or the repair station responsible to make sure that they write in the maintenance records what they did, it's also the owner's responsibility. If the tire's flat and it won't hold air, so you take it in and get it fixed, when the owner comes to pick up the airplane, it's their responsibility to look in the maintenance records and make sure that the mechanic or the repair station wrote in the work that they did. Now, the FAA is going to have a really hard time making sure that a pilot who doesn't own the airplane could be held responsible for this. Say, let you go out to the airplane, and even if somebody hands you the maintenance records, what if it doesn't say anything about the flat tire that got fixed yesterday? You don't know if it got fixed, and away you go. So the FAA cannot hold a rental pilot responsible for having mechanics record maintenance in the logbooks because they don't know that the maintenance got done. Having ADs accomplished, I've already touched on that a little bit. Certainly the owner is going to be held responsible, and certainly the mechanic, if they sign off a 100-hour or an annual or a progressive inspection and the airworthiness directive was due before the date they signed it, then the mechanic or repair station would be held responsible. But a rental pilot, even if somebody hands you the list of airworthiness directives that have been complied with, there's no way for you to know if one's missing because the page, the very next line would be blank. You can't look at it and go, oh, this is blank, but I know something's supposed to be there because nobody's sending you the airworthiness directive. So definitely the owner is going to be held responsible to make sure that the airworthiness directives have been accomplished, but not the rental pilot. Now this one right here, maintaining an aircraft in an airworthy condition, both the owner and the operator, that is the owner and a rental pilot, are going to be held responsible. If the owner knows that something's broke on the airplane and they let somebody fly it, they're going to get in trouble with the feds. If you fly the airplane when something's broken and you know about it as a rental pilot, you're going to get busted. Also, this also can be used to apply to if you accidentally overspeed the engine or put the flaps down when you're going too fast, or you go past red line airspeed, or you land really hard. Those are things that would make the airplane unairworthy, and if you as a rental pilot fail to tell the owner that you did something to the airplane, now the airplane's not being maintained in an airworthy condition, and you as the rental pilot will be held responsible for not writing up things that you did to the aircraft. Ensuring appropriate inspections are valid. Both the owner and the operator are going to be held responsible. Let's say somebody owns a Cessna 172 and you're going to go fly at IFR, and the owner could have, and it's been more than 24 calendar months since the altimeter static system has been inspected and calibrated, and you go fly at IFR. The owner is going to be held responsible for allowing the airplane to go be flown IFR, and you as the rental pilot, well in this case you're not even renting it, but you as the loaner pilot, you're going to be held responsible too. And this applies to 100-hour annuals, progressive inspections. It applies to ELT inspections. It applies to life-limited components. It applies to automatic altitude reporting systems. That's the encoding. That's the Mode C check. And, of course, like I said, the altimeter static system inspection. Both the owner and the operator are both going to be held responsible for not flying the airplane unless those inspections are valid. Now, there are some special inspections, which I already covered. Altimeter static systems, they have to be valid whenever you're flying under instrument flight rules, even if you're flying in uncontrolled airspace, even if you're not filing an IFR flight plan, which you can do if you're not in controlled airspace. You still have to have the altimeter and static system inspected within the last 24 calendar months. The altitude reporting system, that's only good for 24 calendar months, and it has to be valid anytime you turn it on, but the FAR say if you got it, you got to turn it on, so that if you got that in your airplane, you got to have it valid it's got to have been done within the last 24 calendar months. ELT inspections are valid for 12 calendar months, so whenever you go flying, you want to make sure that the ELT on the aircraft has been inspected within the last 12 calendar months. And of course, why must these things be written up? It's that previous Part 91. It's the airplane's not going to be in an airworthy condition if you've made a hard landing or oversped the flaps and didn't have a mechanic or a repair station look at it to make sure the airplane is still airworthy. So, morally and ethically, you need to write those things up, but legally, you need to write them up as well. Okay, inspection systems. There's 3 basic types of inspection systems that you're likely to find and have to understand as a professional pilot. The first one you've heard quite a bit about. It's the 100-hour and annual inspection system. This will be a really fast review for you. If you're a small aircraft, usually operated under the 100-hour and annual inspection system, you have to have an annual inspection done annually, and it's only valid for 12 calendar months, which means if you have an inspection done, say, in September, then it's any day in September, then it's good until the last day of September the following year. So what you could do is take the aircraft into the repair station or give it to the authorized inspector late August and have them finish it the first day of September, and then it would be good for 12.9 months, effectively till the end of September the next year. So you can cheat a little bit. Technically, it's not cheating. 100 hours, however, you can't cheat quite like that. You can exceed the 100 hours if you need to, if you're going to the place where you're going to have the 100-hour inspection done. Let's say you fly to Phoenix or fly from Prescott to Los Angeles, and you just, after you land at Los Angeles, you've got, say, 0.5 hours left. You've got 99.5 hours since the last 100 hour, and it's going to take you 3 hours to get back to Phoenix, so you'll have exceeded the 100 hours by 2.5 hours. You'll land, and it will have been 102.5 hours. You're 2.5 hours over. Now what you'll have to do is subtract 2.5 hours from when the next 100-hour inspection is done. So you cannot cheat. You can exceed the 100-hour, but you're going to have to take that time out of the next 100-hour. You only have to do 100 hours if the aircraft is being operated for hire. However, you got to remember that paying your flight instructor means the airplane is being operated for hire. So now, in addition to having an annual inspection has to have been done in the last 12 calendar months, now also you need a 100-hour inspection done within the last 100 hours. And of course, the annual counts as 100, so you don't have to do an annual and 100 at the same time. You just do the annual. The 3 different things. First of all is who gets to do it. A 100-hour inspection can be done by an A and P mechanic. Typically that's drawn like this, A, and the and sign, A and P mechanic. If you're an A&P mechanic right out of school, you can do 100-hour inspections. If you've been an A&P mechanic for 3 years, active during the last 2 months, you take a big fat written test. You can also have an inspection authorization on top of your A&P. So you have to have your inspection authorization in order to do an annual. And of course, if you're a 145 repair station, then that's going to be in your limitations, and it's likely to say that you can do both. So who gets to do it is one of these 3 differences. And of course, when you do it, the annual inspection is due every 12 calendar months, and the 100-hour is due every 100. And why you have to get it done: if the aircraft is not operated for hire, you only need a valid annual inspection, and if the aircraft is operated for hire, you need a valid annual and a valid 100-hour inspection. What some people don't quite understand is that the visual inspection, the physical inspection of the aircraft, whether it's done by an IA or an A&P for an annual or 100, the physical inspection is the same. You got to look up airworthiness directives, you got to take panels off, you got to check things, inspect them, fix anything that's busted, put it back together again. But what you're doing to the aircraft is identical whether it's a 100-hour or an annual inspection. John Johnson here. Hi, David. I'm doing good. How about you? It was great. It was absolutely great. I sat on the beach and didn't do a thing yesterday. Oceanside, just north of San Diego. Yeah, it was great. Yeah, so am I. Yeah, there was a lot of people boogie boarding, and on the other side of the beach, on the other side of the pier, there were some people surfing. Nah, I don't think they were that great. Uh huh. Okay. All right. Oh, too bad. Yeah, Saturday next weekend would probably be good. Okay. All right. I'll hear from you. Bye bye. Okay, progressive inspection system. A progressive inspection system, well, let's put it like this. Let's just say they take the 100 hour and the annual and everything that you do inside of it right there. For a Cessna 172, it probably takes a good airframe and power plant mechanic about 16 hours of labor to get it done, and at 8 hours a day, that's 2 days of labor. So the airplane is out of service or down for 2 days to get a 100-hour inspection or an annual done. Now that's for a Cessna 172. If instead this wasn't for a 172, this was for a Citation 10 or a big Learjet or some other big business jet, this 100-hour annual inspection, it wouldn't take 16 hours. I'm making this number up, but we'll just say it would take 160 hours. Well, if you divide that by 40 hours a week, that's going to be 4 weeks. If you only have one airplane mechanic on staff for your corporate flight department, the airplane's going to be out of service for a month. It's going to be down for a month. Well, the whole point of having this jet is so you can go when you want. So this isn't going to work out very well. So what you can do under the progressive inspection system is you can chop it up. You can say, you know what, I'm just going to do parts of it at a time. And let's just say, for instance, you chop it up into 12 pieces. All right, what that means is once a month you would pull it out into the hangar and do 1/12 of 160. Well, 160, 12 goes into there. Whoops. One time. And that's about 3. So it'd be 13 or 14 hours. So we'll just say it takes 14 hours to get this 12th of the 100-hour annual inspection done. Well, if you divide that by 8 hours a day, that's a little under 2 days of labor. So now the airplane's only out of service for 2 days at a time. So the airplane can come in, you can make the mechanic work on weekends. Airplane lands on Friday. You know, it's a corporation. They got come back from their trips on Friday, and the airplane's only out of service for Saturday or Sunday, and it's back again ready for Monday. So as in a progressive inspection, you don't have to remember this, but you have to do the whole thing once to start it going, and then you have to get each piece done no later than 1 year after the last time you did it, because corporations typically fly under FAR 91 and it's not for hire, so you only have to have the annual inspection. So getting these things done, 1/12 of the annual inspection done once every 12 months, by the end of 1 year, all of this will have gotten done again, and then you start all over again. So no part on the airplane goes more than 12 calendar months without getting looked at, so it's just as good as an annual. But the great thing is now, instead of being out of service for 4 weeks, it's only out of service for 2 days at a time. So the whole point of doing a progressive inspection, or why, is so we have lower downtime, or you could also call it lower out of service time, or of course you could call it you could call it more uptime, or you could call it more in service time at any one moment. So that's why people do it. And who typically does it? Corporate flight departments with turbine powered aircraft typically do progressive inspections. And the 100-hour annual inspection, the list of the things you've got to do are in FAR 43, Appendix D. In fact, the name of Appendix D is Scope and Detail of 100-Hour Annual Inspection. So you can do that on an airplane or a helicopter, and you don't have to call the FAA up or do any paperwork. You can just do whatever's on that list in FAR 43, Appendix D, and you're good. But progressive inspection, you have to write this up and submit it to the FAA, take it to the local FSDO, and they have to approve it before you can get going on it. That is also the same as the Continuous Airworthiness Inspection Program. The Continuous Airworthiness Inspection Program, who does it? It's typically the 121 airlines do it, and they do it to save money. They do it based on how you operate the aircraft. I'll give you an example here. Let's just say two 747-400s get purchased from Boeing. One of them gets purchased by Qantas, and they fly it from Los Angeles International in California to Sydney, Australia, and back. That's a 14-hour flight. It takes a long time. You don't cycle the landing gear very often. So we'll just say Qantas here. They do 14-hour flights. But Japan Airlines, they buy the exact same airplane, and they do half-hour flights because they're flying the same exact airplane from Tokyo to Osaka, and it's only a 30-minute ride. Well, guess what? The JAL airplane, they operate the landing gear every half of an hour. Qantas, they only operate it every 14. If you call up Boeing, and Boeing will help set up this continuous airworthiness inspection program. You call up Boeing and they say, well, you probably ought to inspect the landing gear every 100 hours. Well, every 100 cycles. Well, if you accomplish a landing gear cycle every half of an hour, that means you're going to get 100 cycles in 50 hours of use for JAL. But if you only cycle the landing gear once every 14, wow, you're going to have to go to 1,400 hours to give you 100 cycles. So if you pull, let's just say Qantas pulls their airplane in every 100 hours and they check the landing gear, they're checking it 14 times too often. They're wasting their time, their money, the hangar, the mechanics, and the airplane is out of service, not making money, when you don't need to inspect the landing gear that often. If JAL waited to 100 hours, then they'd be going to 200 cycles. They wouldn't be inspecting it enough, and something might break and they might not catch it. And then if the airplane breaks, now it's going to be out of service when it's not even scheduled to be out of service. So the continuous airworthiness system for Qantas, they're going to set up some kind of a system so that when the airplane, somewhere around 1,400 hours in service, that's when they're going to inspect the landing gear. They'll inspect it often enough that they'll find things before it breaks so they can fix them, but they won't inspect it so often that the airplane's out of service and not generating revenue. JAL, they're going to have to pull the airplane into the hangar every 50 hours and inspect the landing gear. They'll be inspecting it often enough that they'll find things, hopefully, before they break, but they won't be inspecting it so often that they're pulling the airplane into the hangar and taking it out of service or having the aircraft down and not be generating revenue. So it's based on how you operate the aircraft. So the continuous airworthiness program, depending on how, and for instance, the fuselage is going to expand and contract every time you pressurize it. So there's pressurization cycles. So the engines don't have to get started nearly as often with Qantas. So Qantas isn't going to have to inspect some things very often, but it might be the reverse for the lavatories. Qantas, on a 14-hour flight, pretty much everybody on that airplane is going to the can 2 or 3 times. But on a JAL flight of 30 minutes, it's possible that half of the people on the airplane don't ever use it. So maybe Qantas has to inspect their lavatories more often and the associated systems with the water and all that, and maybe JAL doesn't have to do it as often because theirs doesn't get used as often. So every part on the aircraft is going to be looked at by Boeing and by the FAA, or if it's JAL, the Japanese version of FAA, and the airline, and they're going to decide how often do we need to inspect it so that we're saving money by fixing things before they break, but we're not losing money by taking the airplane out of service and not having revenue. There's two more types of inspection systems that are possible for you to set up on transport category airplanes in particular. It's one that's recommended by the manufacturer. Generally speaking, if this is done under 121, it's going to look very, very similar to the Continuous Airworthiness Inspection Program or the Progressive Inspection Program. So if the manufacturer has one of these programs set up or has one recommended, you can write yours up. You'll have to probably modify it a little bit to fit your aircraft and how you operate it and what your needs are. And you'll have to get it approved by the FAA before you can start it up. Just like the Progressive and the Continuous Airworthiness, the manufacturer's recommended inspection system is going to have to be approved in advance by the FAA before you get to do it. And then interestingly enough, in that part of FAR 91, it also lists any system that the FAA approves. Oh wait, in order to start a system that the FAA approves, you must get FAA approval. So the only one of these four that you don't have to go see the FAA to start up is if you're operating your aircraft under the 100-hour/annual system, which most small general aviation piston-powered airplanes are operated under. Interestingly enough, Embry-Riddle at Prescott is actually unusual for most operators in that we use the progressive inspection system instead of the 100-hour annual.
Airline maintenance. If you have a 121 or a 135 operation, you had to get your air agency certificate approved. When you got that approved, you had to write up a flight operations manual, an FOM, similar to what we have at the flight line, and you have to write up a maintenance operations manual, or MOM, that includes your continuous airworthiness inspection program and pre-flight stuff like that. In it, you're going to have a certified repair station. That is, I've never seen a 121 operation, at least, that didn't have an FAR 145 repair station, and the vast majority of 135 operations have a 145 repair station as well. Now, when you go out and pre-flight a Cessna 172, it probably takes you 10 or 15 minutes. If you go out and pre-flight a transport category jet and you stick all the tanks and check all the engine reservoirs and the hydraulic reservoirs, it's going to take you a lot more than 10 or 15 minutes. So what occurs at the 121 operations is that a ground person, trained ground personnel, are going to do the pre-flight. When I was in the service on B-52s, it took 8 hours of labor to do a complete pre-flight. So they'd usually put 4 people on it, and it would take 2 hours. 2 hours times 4 people is 8 hours. That way the flight crew wouldn't have to come out to the airplane and do the whole pre-flight, which for one, mainly because it would cut into your crew duty day. If you've only got 12 hours of crew duty day from showtime to when you have to land, then you only have 2 pilots and it takes 8 hours of labor. It'd take you 4 hours just for you to pre-flight the airplane. Besides, you don't have 4 hours for the airplane to sit around very often. So ground personnel are going to do the pre-flight. The walk-around is going to be done by the lowest ranking flight deck crew member. If you've got a pilot, a co-pilot, and a flight engineer, the flight engineer is going to do it. If it's a 2-person flight crew, then the co-pilot or first officer is going to do it. And you're just going to be checking for major things: flat tires, leaking hydraulics, fuel leaks, are the lights working, has anybody run into the airplane with a ground tug. And the pre-flight, when it's done by ground personnel, they're going to write it down in the maintenance records that are inside of the airplane. And typically at 121 operations, the pre-flights are valid for 48 hours. So if it gets done at 6 a.m. on the 27th of the month, as long as you take off by 6 a.m. on the 29th of the month, the pre-flight's still valid. So typically you don't have to do a pre-flight every day. And of course you look for that as the pilot in command when you're looking at the aircraft records before you go. And obviously you'd look at the discrepancies as well, but you check to see how much fuel is in the airplane, because you're not going to be sticking it, and you're going to check to see when the last pre-flight was done. Letter checks are part of the continuous airworthiness inspection system. I'm going to make up some numbers here. These aren't real, but let's just say an A check is done every 300 hours. A B check is done every 600 hours. A C check is done every 1200 hours. And then a D check is done every 18,000 hours. Now this gets written up in the MOM, the Maintenance Operations Manual, inside of, as part of the Continuous Airworthiness Inspection Program. So these numbers are very generic. They're not specific to any operation or any particular airplane. So you get the airplane brand new, it gets up to 300 hours, you're going to have to pull the airplane in, take some panels off, inspect some things, fix anything you find wrong, put it back together again. And let's say it's a 737. It's probably going to go in for a day or two in the hangar, but you got to remember there's usually 3 shifts a day, and they'll put 10 people on it per shift. So that's quite a lot of labor to have an A check done. Then you kick it back out, it flies around until it hits 600 hours, and now the B check is due. Of course, when you hit a B check at 600 hours, the A check is also due, because 600 can be divided into by 300 evenly. So when a B check comes in, you're going to do a B check and an A check. More panels will be taken off, more things will be inspected. Instead of taking 1 or 2 days, it'll take 3 or 4 days with 10 people on it per shift, 8 hours a shift, 3 shifts a day. And then they'll kick it back out of the hangar, and you'll go fly until you hit 900 hours, because at 900 you'll have to do the next 300, the next A check. Then when you get to 1200 hours and you need a C check, then of course a B check and an A check will also be due. Now it might take 5 or 6 or 7, maybe 8 days, 3 shifts a day, 10 people a day, 10 people per shift. Airplane's going to be out of service for probably more than a week, maybe even 2 for a C check. Then, of course, when it gets to 12 to 1500, another A check. So anytime the hours are divisible by any of these, you're going to either have to do an A, B, C check or a combination thereof. And then probably 10, 12, 13 years down the road, you're going to hit 1800 hours total time on the airframe. It's going to come in for a D check. The D check is the Massey Ferguson of all letter checks, in that it's the most extensive. In a D check, you pretty much take everything off of the airplane. If you went into a hangar and the airplane was in the middle of a D check, half or more of the cockpit would be gone. The floor would be out. The floor of the cabin would be gone. Every single panel that could be screwed off is off, and a lot of portions of the airplane that you have to drill out the rivets to get the aluminum sheet metal off, those are drilled out. The engines are gone. The flight controls are gone. It's up on jacks. The landing gear is gone. They're going to strip all the paint off of it and inspect every piece of metal on it completely. It's very expensive, and this could take 3 or 4 weeks of 10 people per shift, 3 shifts a day, 5 or 6 days a week. And so this is going to cost a lot of money. On a 737, a D check might be 10, 15, or $20 million just in labor and parts. Most of that is labor, and that doesn't count overhauling the engines. So you do a D check. So the airplane's out of service for a while, so you got to schedule it. It gets done with the D check, and then you start over essentially at 0 hours and work up to your first A check at 300. Now, when it comes up on that second D check, it's that second D check. And you'll notice nobody calls it Alpha check, Bravo check, Charlie check, or Delta check. You come up on that second D check, and the accountants at the airline are going to seriously consider, okay, we're coming up on 36,000 hours on this airplane. It's going to cost us $20 million. And that second one's going to cost more than the first one, because more things are going to be broke. More things are going to be fixed. And they go, wow, we've had this airplane for 20 years. Do we really want to spend $20 million on it? Or do we want to buy a brand new 737 that has engines that have 20 years better technology, burn less fuel? That's why when you look out at Davis-Monthan, or not Davis-Monthan, but you look at Marana or Mojave airports, you see airplanes out there, and most of those have come up on their second D check. Maybe a few of them came up on their third one. And the airlines decided it would save more fuel and we'd have better dispatch reliability rates if we just bought a new airplane instead of spent the money to overhaul it. So that second D check is the most likely time an airline is going to sell their plane and get a new one. Now, you don't need to memorize any of these numbers. You don't need to memorize any of these words here. ATA stands for Airline Transport Association. Airline Transport
Association. The Airline Transport Association was formed decades and decades ago because the U.S. government wasn't providing all the services to the airlines that the airlines thought they needed. So they got together and said, hey, we'll form this nonprofit corporation and we'll all pitch in some cash and we'll get the things we need. And they put out standards and get a lot of things done. And they realized a couple decades ago that if you were a pilot going from one airplane to another, that the emergency checklist isn't always in Chapter 3. So what they decided to do was standardize approved flight manuals. So that right now, whether it's Boeing or it's Airbus or it's Embraer or Canadair or whoever it is, or Tupolev, then if you go to Chapter 3, you're going to get the emergency procedures. The General Aviation Manufacturers Association, GAMA, did the same thing a decade or two ago, so now little airplanes, it's all the same as well. All right, preventive maintenance or preventative maintenance. I looked it up in Webster's Intercollegiate Dictionary of 1959, and preventive and preventative are two different spellings and two different pronunciations for the same thing. If you've read the reading assignment, FR 43 Appendix A talks about minor repairs and major repairs, and then it goes on to have a paragraph and then a list of things, 30 some odd things you can do. It has a paragraph listing privileges and limitations for pilots if you have a private pilot certificate or higher and you are the owner or operator, and the FAA considers the rental pilot to be the operator, and you're not operating for 121 or 135, and the preventative maintenance you want to do is on that list in FAR 43, then you can do it. So if you have a student pilot certificate or sport pilot certificate, you can't do preventive maintenance. You got to be the owner or the operator, and you got to have at least a private. You can't do this maintenance under 121 or 135. There is one minor exception. I have seen where some 135 helicopter operators teach their pilots to pull out the magnetic chip detector out of the transmissions when the red light comes on, and then clean it and put it back in. That way the pilot can do it when they're off station somewhere and there's no maintenance available, but that's a rare exception. Like I said, the preventive maintenance you want to do has to be listed in FAR 43 Appendix A. It has things like changing oil filters and engine oil, servicing the hydraulic system, it interestingly says you can troubleshoot and repair the landing light circuit. You can do wheels and tires. You can paint the aircraft except for the balanced control surfaces. You can do the interior upholstery of an airplane. You can remove and replace the cowling. So there's a lot of things on that list that you can do, but if it's not on that list, you can't do it under preventive maintenance. And don't try to memorize the list. I'm not going to ask you what's on the list. If you want to know what it is in real life, you'll have to look it up. Unfortunately, any person who does maintenance on an aircraft, including preventive maintenance, has to comply with FAR 43. And FAR 43 has some things in it about how well you have to do your maintenance, and a couple of things pilots tend to forget to do is that, one, you have to use and follow an updated, revised current maintenance manual, and secondly, the airplane isn't airworthy, the aircraft isn't airworthy until after the work has been done and until a maintenance record has been entered into the permanent maintenance record. So you got to write down what you did and the maintenance logbook. So if you change a tire, not only do you have to follow the maintenance manual, an updated maintenance manual, you have to write in the maintenance records that you did that. And those are the two common errors that pilots tend to forget, is they forget to use an updated and current maintenance manual, and they forget to write down their maintenance actions in the maintenance records. Here's some terms pilots need to know about. TSO stands for Technical Standard Order. Technical Standard Order. If somebody wants to build an appliance, say a radio, some brakes, tires, wheels, a battery, a magneto, an alternator, a rotating beacon, some strobe lights, these are all appliances, and they're reasonably generic in that an ELT that'll fit in the tail of a 172 will fit into a Piper Warrior,
or a Robinson R-22 helicopter, or a Beechcraft Bonanza. Same thing with tires and batteries and stuff like that. So if it's going to be essentially a generic part, then it's going to be built under a TSO, Technical Standard Order, and that means the FAA is approved for you to make it, and now anybody can buy it and put it on pretty much on any aircraft. FAA PMA stands for Federal Aviation Administration. You'd be surprised how many people can't spell Federal Aviation Administration on the test. PMA is Parts Manufacturer Approval. Parts Manufacturer Approval. FAA PMA is for parts that somebody makes that only fit on one kind of an aircraft. Say you decide you want to build parts and you want to build a Cessna 172 windshield. Well, it only fits on, say, 10 models of 172s, but that same windshield won't fit on a Piper Seminole or a Bell helicopter or Viking Balanka Viking. So if you're going to build a part that only fits on one or very few number of aircraft, then you're going to have it certified under FAA PMA. AOG is a three-letter abbreviation that stands for Aircraft on Ground. Aircraft on Ground. Effectively, you're stuck somewhere and the airplane's broken and you're waiting for parts. So if you read a magazine called Professional Pilot and you open it up and see an advertisement and it says, "We specialize in AOG," it means they've got a warehouse full of airplane parts and they got the hookup with FedEx and UPS and they will get it to you the very next morning because they want you to get off of the ground, so they don't want your aircraft to be aircraft on the ground, AOG. TBO stands for Time Between Overhaul. Time Between Overhaul. Now, if you have a manufacturer's recommended TBO, if it's under Part 91, you don't have to have the engine overhauled or the propeller overhauled or the magneto overhauled, as long as it keeps passing that annual or 100 progressive inspection or however you're handling it. As long as it keeps passing the inspection, you can run past the TBO if the airplane's operated under Part 91. Even if it's operated Part 91 for hire, you can go past the recommended TBO. However, when you're writing up your maintenance operations manual for a 121 or a 135 operation, the FAA is not going to approve your air agency certificate unless you write into your MOM that you're going to overhaul everything at the manufacturer's recommended TBO. So effectively, it's mandatory under 121 and 135. Service bulletins are put out by the manufacturer, and they have recommended things to do. They've noticed a few things going wrong with the airplane. Usually it's not, critical that you're going to die if you don't do it, although every now and then it is. And it's the same as TBOs in that under Part 91, including Part 91 for hire, you don't have to comply with the service bulletins. I recommend it. We do it at Embry-Riddle. We do all the service bulletins, but it's only required to comply with the service bulletins if the aircraft is being operated under 121 or 135. Okay, here's a fun list. This is a bunch of stuff you got to do to make sure the airplane's airworthy, make sure you're airworthy. If you recall at the beginning of Airworthiness Requirements Part 1, how do you know if an airplane's airworthy? Well, there's tons of stuff you got to check. And I've made up a list. I'm not going to say that it's complete, but this would be a great start for you to make up your own list. And I am going to ask you questions about it on the test. It'll probably be something like name 41 of the 39 different things that pilots have to do before they go flying to make sure they and the airplane are airworthy. So let's take a peek here at the first list. Now here's a list of equipment and documents that would need to be on board the aircraft that are usually already there when you show up. Of course, we all know you got to have an airworthiness certificate. You got to have a federal registration certificate. Some states require a state registration certificate. You have to have a radio station license if you fly outside of the 50 states and U.S. territories. You want to go to Mexico or Canada, you got to have a radio station license from the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. They used to have that on airplanes in the United States, and a decade or two ago the FCC decided to stop worrying about it. But other countries want to know that your radios transmit correctly, so when you land at those other countries, be prepared to have a radio station license. So if you're going to leave the United States, make sure you get a radio station license from the FCC. Instrument markings and placards, green arcs, red lines, yellow arcs, white arcs, placards all over the airplane saying you got to close and lock the door and blah, blah, blah like that. Those things all have to be in the aircraft and legible for it to be airworthy. Also, if the airplane was built after, I think it was sometime in 1979, small airplanes, that is, it started coming out with approved flight manuals. Big airplanes have had it for a long time. So if you have a small aircraft built after the late 70s, you're going to have an approved flight manual that's specific to the serial number of that airframe. That one you bought at the bookstore is just for reference only. You got to have the approved flight manual for that particular aircraft in the aircraft. And, of course, I'm sure you get taught to check for that at the flight line. You have to take care of the discrepancies, whether you use the 4+3 method out of Part 91, whether you have an MEL, whether you have a special flight permit, or, of course, the fourth way would be to actually fix it. You got to legally, morally, and ethically take care of any discrepancies that you find so that the airplane will be airworthy. And, of course, a piece of paper somewhere in the airplane has to have the weight and balance data for that particular aircraft that has the empty weight center of gravity. Now, we usually stick them in with the approved flight manual, but heck, if you wanted to, you could duct tape it to the ceiling or fold it up and stick it in the glove box, and that would be an acceptable place to keep that weight and balance data for that particular aircraft. Of course, if you have a minimum equipment list, you're going to need that, and it's approved. You need that minimum equipment list with the letter of authorization on board the aircraft at all times. If you're going to fly, if you have a GPS that's IFR certificated and you're going to use it for IFR, you need to have a piece of paper that says what you can do with it. Usually it'll say you can use it for IFR en route only, or it'll say you can use it for IFR en route and IFR approaches. Also, if you're going to use GPS as one of your primary methods of navigation, even if you're VFR and you're going to use it for one of your primary means of navigation, you got to make sure that the database hasn't expired. This may not be a piece of paper. It may just be calling it up on the screen, and make sure that the database date hasn't expired yet. And, of course, if you're going to fly higher than 12,500 feet up to, I think it's 14,500 for more than 30 minutes, or above 14,500, the required flight crew has to have oxygen, so you might be needing to take that with you, or it might be on the aircraft already. Okay, here's a list of things that you, as the pilot, generally bring with you. Of course, you've got to bring your airman certificates. If you're a flight instructor, you'll also bring your CFI as long as your pilot certificates. You got to have a government-issued photo ID now. Most people use their driver's license, but a passport would work. You got to have your valid medical certificate with you, and you have to comply with any medical restrictions, like, for instance, I wear eyeglasses. RROP, you don't have to write this out for the test, but RROP stands for Restricted Radio Telephone Operators Permit. Restricted Radio Telephone Operators Permit. And this licenses, effectively, the person who's talking on the radio inside the United States. The FCC, again, a decade or two ago, decided it was too much of a pain in the butt to require pilots to have these pieces of paper. There wasn't even a test for it. You just filled out a form, signed it, tore out the perforated little card, and sent the rest of it in. I still have my perforated card from 1977. And all it does is say that you know how to operate a radio. Inside the 50 states and U.S. territories, the FCC doesn't care if you have one of these, but as soon as you leave the United States, go into international waters, go to a foreign country, you might get ramp checked, and if you do, they're going to want to see your Restricted Radio Telephone Operator's Permit. Effectively, that's the FCC telling them that you know how to talk on the radio. Okay, you got to bring appropriate charts with you. Hopefully that's pretty obvious by now. If you're going to solo, you got to have your solo endorsements with you. You could put those endorsements in someplace other than your logbook, so technically you don't have to bring your logbook. But you got to have your solo endorsements with you. If you fly at Embry-Riddle wants you to take the flight operations manual with you, but that's not required by the FAA. But if you fly for a 121 or a 135 operation, you will need to make sure that the flight operations manual is on board the airplane. And, of course, if you're flying at night, you need some flashlight and batteries. And under 121 or 135, correct me if I'm wrong, they got to be D-cell battery type flashlights. Okay, now here's a list of things you got to do. You got to comply, you got to check, and the FAA is, generally speaking, going to want this to be written down somewhere. So wherever you find this stuff, make sure you're going to be able to find it later. You have to have the inspection for the aircraft needs to be still valid, whether you're doing it under the 100-hour annual system, the progressive, or the continuous airworthiness inspection system. There has to be an inspection that's valid for the aircraft and hasn't expired yet. Of course, if you're going to go fly an IFR, you need a valid altitude correction. This is the automatic altitude reporting system, so that you need that if you got a mode C on your transponder. It's got to be valid anyway. And if you're going to go flying IFR, even in uncontrolled airspace, you got to have a valid altimeter static system inspection. You got to have an ELT inspection that's still valid, and you can't have any life-limited components having expired. Life-limited components are a component that's bolted into the aircraft that when it hits its life limit, you have to throw it away. You cannot fix it, you cannot repair it, you cannot do anything to it to make it airworthy again. Typically, mechanics, when they take those parts off, they'll cut them in half or bend them or do something to them so it's very obvious that they can't be accidentally installed back on an aircraft. So life-limited components, for instance, turbine blades aft of the combustion chamber, the rotating turbine blades typically have life limits of so many thousand starts, like you may hit 6,000 starts and you got to throw them away or melt them down. Helicopter rotor blades are a very common thing, like Robinson R-22s and R-44s. The rotor blades have a 2,200 hour life limit. That is, when they hit 2,200 hours, you have to throw them away. You can't repair them, you can't inspect them, you can't fix them, you can't do anything to them to make them airworthy again. So when a life-limited component hits its life limit, then you got to get rid of it. And FAA does expect pilots, including rental pilots, besides the owner, to make sure that they do not fly an aircraft if the life limit has been exceeded. So that needs to be on your list. Typical life-limited components in an airplane like a 172 is the ELT batteries. The ELT batteries commonly are not of the rechargeable type. They have a life limit, and that'll be written on the ELT, and that'll be written in the maintenance records. And the FAA does expect a pilot in command, even of a rental aircraft, to know when all the life-limited components are going to hit their life limits. So you need to be cognizant of that. Okay, if you're going to go fly an IFR, you have to have a VOR accuracy check if you're going to use the VORs for primary navigation. It's got to have been done within the last 30 days. You do have to have, but you don't have, there's nothing that says you have to take that with you. Of course, it wouldn't hurt to take that with you. Endorsements for high performance, complex aircraft, high altitude endorsement, a tailwheel endorsement. If you're going to fly these type of aircraft, you have to have that endorsement somewhere. It doesn't have to go in your logbook, although that's where it usually goes. And you don't have to bring it with you, although technically, most of the time I take my logbook with me. But these endorsements have to be written down somewhere. You must have a flight review that was done within the last 24 calendar months or received a new certificate or rating within the last 24 calendar months. This has to be written down somewhere. You don't have to have it with you, but it's got to be written down somewhere. Of course, you have to have your 3 takeoffs and landings within the last 90 days. And if you're going to fly at night with passengers, you got to have 3 takeoffs and landings in the last 90 days. If it's a tailwheel, it's also got to be full stop. This has to be written down, but it doesn't have to be with you, but it does have to be written down somewhere. If you're going to go fly IFR, there are certain recency of experience requirements in the last 6 months that you have to have taken care of. Usually you write that down in your logbook, and usually you take your logbook with you. It's got to be written down somewhere, certainly, and it's got to be available in case the FAA wants to see it. Okay, now the following list here is a list of things that you're going to have to check or calculate, but it's not specifically written down anywhere that you have to write these things down. I'm going to suggest it's a good idea if you write these things down in case somebody asks if you get ramp checked by the FAA, but there's no FAR that says when you do these things, you then have to write them down. The physical pre-flight. When was the last time you wrote down, I did the pre-flight on the airplane? You don't have to do it. Be careful when I ask you this question on the test. Doing the pre-flight inspection of the airplane, that's only one item. So on the test, don't say, I checked the tires to see if they were flat, and I checked the brakes to make sure that there was still some brake pad left, and I checked the fuel tank caps to make sure they were on. Those are all part of the pre-flight of the aircraft. That's one thing you have to do, is physically inspect the aircraft to make sure it's in a safe condition for flight. Approved flight manual, required equipment. In the approved flight manual, there's going to be required equipment list. Everything on that list has to be on board the airplane and be working. So you are responsible as the pilot in command to make sure that everything on that list is in the airplane, on the airplane, attached to the airplane, etc. Psychological factors. Are you mentally fit to fly?
Physiological factors. Are you physically fit? Do you have enough sleep, enough water, enough rest? So psychological factors is one, and physiological factors is another thing that you need to check. Doesn't say you have to write it down. I checked myself. I looked in the mirror and I grinned. But you do need to pay attention to those. Also, you got to check the weather. It's a good idea to write it down, but I haven't found any place that says you have to write it down. You could all remember it in your head. Even when you're going to go fly around the traffic pattern, looking out the window of your car on the way to the airport, walking out to the airplane, that's checking the weather. So there's pretty much no way you can go flying without checking the weather. You got to figure out how much fuel you need for your flight. If you've flown Dave VFR to Kingman a couple of times and you go out to the airplane and the tanks are full, I think you know whether or not you're going to meet your FAA requirements for fuel and a reserve. So one could argue you might not actually have to spin a flight plan, but definitely you need to make sure that you have figured out your route of flight and figured out that you're going to have enough fuel for that flight. If you're going to go fly IFR, you may need to have an alternate airport in case your planned destination, the weather gets really bad and you can't land. You have to have an alternate under certain circumstances, and those alternates have to meet certain requirements. You have to do weight and balance calculations for that particular flight. Now, there's only so many ways to load a 172, so after you've done weight and balance 5 or 6 times, you probably just pull one out and say, here, this is what we're doing today. But, hey, you calculated it. If it's accurate, that's great. Does the FAA say you have to write this down somewhere? Doesn't say you have to write it down. Is it a good idea? Yeah, that's a good idea. Takeoff and landing performance. This is figuring out, do you have enough runway to take off, and do you have enough runway to land? Well, in a 172, having a 7,000-foot long runway, usually you don't have to worry too much about having enough runway. But when you get to transport category jets, big biz jets, big turboprops, every takeoff and landing is a short field takeoff and landing, so you're always going to be very careful, very conscientious about checking your takeoff performance, and is your runway going to be long enough, so you're going to be checking landing performance as well. Obviously, you're going to check for NOTAMs at any airports you think you're going to go to. Especially if you're flying IFR, you're going to want to check for air traffic control delays. But if you're flying into a big airport like Las Vegas or Los Angeles or San Diego, maybe even Phoenix, it wouldn't be bad to ask the flight service station briefer if there's any air traffic control delays. Because if there are, you need to put more fuel on board the airplane. You need to take that into account. Obviously, if you're flying IFR, you're going to file, open and close, and the air traffic control is going to open and close your flight plan for you, but it's a really good idea, so I'm going to actually put this in here as opening and closing as well as filing a flight plan. Now, all those lists up there on the test, I'm going to ask you, like I said, to name 41 of the 39 of them. You will not have to break them down by which category. You won't have to break them down by which category. Now, here's a bunch of stuff I'm not going to ask you on the test, so I'm going to go through this really fast. These are things that it's really good to take with you, but the FAA doesn't absolutely mandate you take. Pencils, pens, and paper to write things down on. You don't have to take the FAR AIM, but it's not a bad idea. You don't have to take the airport facility directory with you, but why copy everything out of it? You might as well take it with you. I recommend sunglasses if you're going to fly in the day. Cell phone is a good standby method of talking to somebody if the radios break. Take some water with you so you don't get dehydrated. Take some snacks with you, protein especially, so your blood sugar doesn't get too low. You also might want to take your logbook with you. Take a credit card in case you get stuck somewhere overnight. Remain Overnight, RON, Remain Overnight kit. Just a bag with an extra set of clothes in it. You might want to take a jacket. If you got some spare $300, you can get a handheld transceiver with VHF COM and VOR receiver in it. You might want to bring a handheld GPS in case you have full electrical system failure. You can still figure out where you are going on top of your dead reckoning and pilotage. But like I said, I'm not going to ask you about this list on the test. Hey, let's talk about getting ramp checked. It's like you're driving down the road and there's a sobriety test and the cop has you roll down your window and then smells you to see if you smell like alcohol. It's not quite the same with the FAA. The FAA does do ramp checks. They can only do it when you're performing air operations. So once you've tied down the airplane and you're walking away from the airplane, your air operations are done. Unless you're going somewhere to call and close your flight plan, one could argue you're still performing air operations then. So they can't, if you're getting into your car, they can't do a ramp check on you. You can't really stop them from looking at the outside of the airplane, but there is a thought that in the FAA ramp check inspectors handbook it says they can't unduly delay your flight. So they usually ramp check you after you land, so that way they can't unduly delay your flight. But you're always going to have to show them 5 things no matter what. Now there's a lot of discussion about, do you have to let them look inside of the airplane? That would be a good question to ask your AOPA attorney, and see if you could say, hey, I got an appointment, I got to go. Can you mail me a written request for all these other things you want from me, like my weight and balance and my flight plan and fuel requirements and my VOR accuracy check? That might be one way to handle it, is that you're going to be unduly delaying. They would be unduly delaying you. But no matter what, right then, under every circumstance, you got to show them GRAMP. You got to show them your government-issued photo ID, your registration certificate, your airworthiness certificate, and your medical certificate. So handing them these things, including your pilot certificates, does not constitute surrendering your certificate. That is an urban myth. You aren't surrendering it unless they have you fill out a form saying, I understand that I'm surrendering it. So handing these things over to them during a ramp check is not surrendering your pilot certificate. But you got to show them a minimum of these things no matter what, absolutely. They have a whole list of things that they're going to want to look for. They're going to look for worn out, ratty, torn seat belts. They're going to want to know when your last biennial flight review was, or your last check ride. What kind of charts did you have? If you were IFR, VOR check. They'll want to know when the last ELT battery, life limited component, ELT battery needs to be replaced. Your weight and balance data for the aircraft, that has to be in the airplane. What calculations did you make? Are the operating limitations in the airplane? Is the approved flight manual in the airplane? What did you do about inoperative equipment? And they can ask for pretty much anything they want to. So I encourage you to treat them just like a police officer. Say yes, sir, and yes, ma'am. Try to comply with what they're asking for. If you don't have it with you, say, would you send me a letter asking me for that, or take notes? There's a lot of stuff that you have to have done, but you didn't have to write down and have with you. So that's a good way to say, hey, would you, I got that stuff at the house. Would you send me a letter, and I'll be happy to Xerox copies of it or bring it into the office. If you have any questions or you have some improvements about Airworthiness Section 2, let me know.